Hello, and welcome to your sanctuary for the night. You're listening to NightSleepWhisper. Tonight, we have a very special long-form journey prepared for you. The full 50-chapter mystery of Crimson Bay. It is a story of storms, old lighthouses, and a doctor's search for the truth in a world of shadows. Close your eyes. Take a deep, slow breath, and let the sound of my voice be your guide. As the story unfolds, feel your body grow heavy and your mind become still. We are heading to the coast now. Let's begin. The train moved slowly through the dark afternoon. Dr. Edward Thorne looked out of the window. He saw tall trees and grey hills. Everything was wet from the recent rain. He was very tired after his long journey from London. London was a big, busy city. It was full of too many people and too much noise. Edward wanted a quiet life. He wanted to be a doctor in a small village. He hoped Crimson Bay was the right place for him. The train stopped at a small station. White steam filled the air and covered the windows. Edward could not see the platform for a moment. He grabbed his heavy leather bag and his black medical kit. He stepped off the train and onto the old wooden floor of the station. The wood was slippery and cold. A man in a dark blue coat walked toward him. This was the station master. He was an adult with a grey beard and a serious face. He carried a small metal lamp. The light from the lamp moved back and forth in the wind. "Are you the new doctor?" the man asked. His voice was deep and slow. "Yes," Edward answered. "I am Dr. Edward Thorne. Welcome to Crimson Bay, Doctor," the station master said. He did not smile. He looked at the thick fog behind the station. "The weather is very bad today. The wind is strong, and the sea is angry. You chose a difficult day to arrive." Edward looked around. The station was very small and very old. There were no other people there. He felt a cold wind on his face. The air had a strange, sharp smell. It was the smell of salt and old fish. He knew the ocean was very near, even if he could not see the water through the fog. "Where is the village?" Edward asked. He wanted to find a warm fire and a bed. The station master pointed a thin finger toward a dark, narrow path. "Follow that road. It goes to the center of the village. It is about 1 mile. Be careful, Doctor. The road is muddy, and the night is coming fast. We do not like to be outside after dark here." The train began to move again. Soon, the train disappeared into the grey mist. Edward was now alone. He felt a little bit nervous. He was a man of science, and he did not believe in scary stories. But the silence of the station felt very heavy. He started to walk. His leather boots made a soft, splashing noise on the wet ground. The trees on the side of the road looked like tall giants in the dark. The fog moved around his legs like a ghost. He held his coat tightly against the wind. He needed to find his new home before the sun went down. Somewhere in the distance, he heard the water of the ocean. The waves hit the rocks with a low, heavy sound. Edward walked for 10 minutes. Then, he saw a small light in the distance. It was a yellow light from a window. He felt happy to see it. He was ready to start his new life. But he felt that Crimson Bay was a place with many secrets. Edward reached the end of the muddy path. The yellow light came from a tall, narrow house. The house was made of dark stone. A small wooden sign hung near the door. It said, "Crimson Bay Medical Clinic." The sign moved back and forth in the wind, making a slow, rhythmic scraping noise against the wall. Edward walked up the stone steps. He was cold and his clothes were wet. He raised his hand and knocked firmly on the door. He waited for a moment. He heard the sound of slow footsteps inside the house. Then, the door opened. A man stood in the doorway. He was an older man with white hair and a very tired face. He wore a thick brown suit and a pair of small, round glasses. This was Dr. Aries. He held a candle in his right hand. The flame jumped in the wind, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. "You must be Dr. Thorne," the old man said. He had a soft, shaky voice. "Please, come in. The air is too cold for a long conversation at the door." Edward stepped inside. The house was warm, but it felt very old. The air smelled like dried herbs, old paper, and candle wax. In the main room, there were shelves from the floor to the ceiling. These shelves were full of green and blue glass bottles. There were also many heavy books with leather covers. "Thank you, Dr. Aries," Edward said. He put his bag on a wooden chair. "I am happy to be here. The journey was very long." Dr. Aries sat down in a large chair by the fireplace. The fire was small and orange. "I am happy you are here, too," the old man whispered. "I have worked in Crimson Bay for 40 years. I am very tired now. I need to leave this village and find some peace." Edward looked at the old doctor. Dr. Aries looked more than just tired. He looked afraid. His hands shook as he held a cup of tea. He kept looking at the window. Outside, the fog was thick and white against the glass. "Is the village quiet?" Edward asked. He wanted to know about his new patients. Dr. Aries did not answer immediately. He looked at the fire for a long time. Then, he leaned forward. "The people here are good, but they are very quiet. They do not like strangers. You must be patient with them." The old doctor stood up and walked to the window. He pointed toward the dark ocean. Edward could not see anything, but he knew the lighthouse was out there in the dark. "I have one important piece of advice for you, Edward," Dr. Aries said. His voice was suddenly very serious. "You are the doctor. You must go to the houses in the village. You must help the sick. But you must never go to the lighthouse. Do not walk on those cliffs at night." Edward was surprised. "Why? Is it dangerous?" "The sea is dangerous," Aries replied quickly. He did not look at Edward's eyes. "The rocks are sharp. People say the lighthouse is a place of shadows. Just stay in the village, doctor. It is better for everyone." Dr. Aries picked up his own bag. "I am leaving now. My carriage is waiting at the back of the house. The clinic is yours. Good luck, Dr. Thorne. I hope you find the peace you are looking for." The old man walked out of the room without saying another word. Edward heard the heavy door close. He was now alone in the silent house. He looked at the empty chair and the dying fire. He wondered why the old doctor was in such a hurry to leave. The next morning, the sun did not shine. The sky was the color of a dirty silver coin. Edward woke up early in the clinic. The bed was hard, and the room was cold. He decided to find the house of Mrs. Gable. Dr. Aries had told him that Mrs. Gable had a room for him to stay in. Edward walked through the village. The streets were made of grey stones. Most of the houses were small and built very close together. He saw a few adults walking to work. A man in a heavy apron was opening a small shop. A woman was carrying a basket of bread. They stopped and looked at Edward as he passed. They did not wave or say hello. Their eyes were cold and curious. He found the house at the very end of the street. It stood on a small hill. From the front door, Edward could see the harbor and the grey water of the bay. The house was small but very clean. He knocked on the door. A woman opened it. She was tall and wore a long black dress. Her hair was pulled back in a tight bun. She looked like a person who did not laugh often. "You must be the new doctor," she said. "I am Mrs. Gable. Please, come inside. I have your room ready." The inside of the house was warm and smelled like lavender. Mrs. Gable took Edward to a small room on the second floor. It had a bed, a wooden desk, and a large window. Through the window, Edward could see the tall lighthouse in the distance. It stood on a high cliff like a lonely giant. "Thank you, Mrs. Gable," Edward said. "This is very nice. I will bring you some tea and bread," she said. A few minutes later, Edward sat at a small table in the kitchen. Mrs. Gable sat across from him. She watched him eat. "Dr. Aries was a good man," she said quietly. "But he was very nervous at the end. The village changed him." "Changed him?" Edward asked. "How?" Mrs. Gable looked at the window. The wind made a low, whistling sound against the glass. "It started 10 years ago," she whispered. "There was a terrible storm. A large ship called the Marianne was coming to our harbor. It was full of expensive things and many people." Edward listened closely. He forgot about his tea. The ship was very near the bay. Mrs. Gable continued. "The lighthouse was dark that night. No one knows why. The ship hit the rocks. But the strange thing is, Doctor, we never found the ship. We never found the wood, the cargo, or the people. It just disappeared." Edward frowned. "A whole ship cannot just disappear. The ocean is deep, but parts of a ship always float." Mrs. Gable shook her head. "Not in Crimson Bay. People say the bay is cursed. They say the ghosts of the Marianne still walk on the cliffs when the fog is thick. That is why we stay inside at night. That is why Dr. Aries was afraid." Edward did not believe in ghosts. He was a man of medicine and facts. But as he looked at the dark, moving water of the bay, he felt a small shiver of fear. The night was very dark. Edward sat in his clinic. He was busy with his medical books. He wanted to learn more about the plants and herbs in this area. A small lamp sat on his desk. The light was yellow and soft. Outside, the wind was very strong. It pushed against the stone walls of the house. He could hear the ocean waves in the distance. They sounded like a heavy drum. Suddenly, there was a loud sound at the front door. Someone was hitting the wood with their hand. Edward stood up quickly. He grabbed his lamp and walked to the door. He felt a little bit nervous because of Mrs. Gable's stories. He opened the door slowly. A man stood there. He was a large man with very tan skin and rough hands. He wore a thick, wet coat that smelled like salt and fish. He was a fisherman from the village. His face was very pale, and his eyes were wide with fear. He held his left arm with his right hand. A piece of old cloth was wrapped around his arm. The cloth was red with blood. "Doctor, please help me," the man said. His voice was shaking. "Come in, sir," Edward said. "Sit down here by the light." The man sat on a wooden stool. Edward gently removed the wet cloth from the man's arm. He looked at the wound. It was not a normal cut from a knife or a piece of glass. It was a circle of small, deep holes. It looked like a bite. "What happened?" Edward asked. He began to clean the wound with warm water and soap. "Did a dog bite you?" The fisherman shook his head. "No, doctor. I was near the old stone wall by the cliffs. I was looking for my lost cat. It was very foggy. I saw a shadow move near the rocks. It was tall and thin. I thought it was a person, so I walked toward it. Then, something jumped at me from the dark. It was too fast to see." Edward looked closely at the bite. The skin around the holes was a strange purple color. "This is very unusual," Edward whispered. The teeth were very small but very sharp. "It was the ghost, doctor," the fisherman said. He looked at the window with fear. "The ghost of Crimson Bay. It lives in the lighthouse, and it comes down to the cliffs when the tide is high. People say it has the teeth of a sea monster." Edward sighed. "Sir, I am a doctor. I do not believe in ghosts or monsters. You were probably bitten by a wild animal. Maybe it was a large rat or a badger." "No rat is that big," the man insisted. "And no animal wears a long black coat." Edward stopped moving. "A black coat? You saw a coat?" "Yes," the man whispered. "A long, dark coat. Like the ones the rich men in London wear." Edward finished cleaning the wound. He put a clean white bandage on the man's arm. He gave the man a small bottle of medicine to help with the pain. The fisherman stood up and thanked him, but he did not look happy. He left the clinic quickly and ran into the dark. Edward stayed by the door for a long time. He looked out at the fog. He did not believe in ghosts, but he knew one thing: animals do not wear black coats. After the fisherman left, Edward could not sleep. The man's story about a shadow in a black coat worried him. He walked around the clinic with his lamp. The clinic was a small building, but it had many dark corners. Dr. Aries had left many things behind. There were old boxes, broken medical tools, and many stacks of dusty papers. In the corner of the small office, Edward noticed a heavy wooden cabinet. It was made of dark oak and had a large metal lock. He tried to pull the handle, but it did not move. He looked for a key on the desk and inside the drawers. Finally, he found a small silver key hidden inside an old hollow book. He put the key into the lock and turned it. The lock opened with a heavy, metallic click. Inside the cabinet, there were many folders. These were the medical files of the people in the village. Edward sat down at his desk and began to read them. He wanted to understand the health of the people in Crimson Bay. He found files for Mrs. Gable and the station master. But then, he found a group of files at the back of the cabinet. These files were different. They were new and very clean. He read the names on the folders: Mr. Jameson, Captain Miller, and Mr. Thorne. Edward froze. He looked at the file with his own name. He opened it. The page was empty. He then looked at the other names. He remembered the village register he saw at the station. These names, Jameson and Miller, were not on the list of villagers. He had lived in the village for only 2 days, but he knew everyone talked about everyone else. He had never heard these names. He looked at the dates on the papers. Some of the medical notes were from only 1 month ago. According to the notes, Mr. Jameson had a fever. Captain Miller had a broken leg. But where were these men? Crimson Bay was a very small place. A captain with a broken leg would be famous in such a small village. Edward felt a cold chill. Why did Dr. Aries have files for people who did not exist? Or, if they did exist, where were they hiding? He looked at the window. The fog was pressing against the glass like a thick white blanket. Suddenly, he saw a light in the distance. It was not from a house. It was a small, moving light near the old garden shed behind the clinic. He stood up and blew out his lamp. He did not want anyone to see him. He watched the light move slowly through the trees. It stayed for a minute and then disappeared into the fog. Edward realized that the secrets of Crimson Bay were much bigger than a few ghost stories. Dr. Aries was not just a tired old man. He was a man who kept many secrets in his locked cabinet. The next morning, the fog was thinner, but the air was still very cold. Edward put on his heavy coat and walked toward the beach. He wanted to see the lighthouse during the day. He followed a path made of sand and small stones. The ocean was a dark, angry green. The waves hit the shore with a heavy sound that felt like a heartbeat. As he walked, Edward saw the lighthouse more clearly. It sat on top of a very high, sharp cliff. It was a tall tower made of white stone, but the paint was old and peeling. It looked lonely against the grey sky. Near the bottom of the cliff, Edward saw a man. The man was sitting on an old wooden crate, looking at the water. He wore a heavy yellow jacket and a hat that covered his ears. He was holding a long piece of rope. This was Silas, the lighthouse keeper. "Good morning," Edward called out. The man did not move at first. Then, he slowly turned his head. His face was like a map of the sea. It was full of deep lines and brown spots from the sun. His eyes were very bright and very blue. "You are the man from the clinic," Silas said. He did not ask. He knew. The village is full of talk about the new doctor who asks too many questions. Edward sat on a nearby rock. "I only want to help the people here, Mr. Silas. I heard about a strange accident 10 years ago. A ship called the Marianne." Silas laughed, but it was not a happy sound. It was a dry, hollow sound. "The Marianne did not have an accident, Doctor. The sea does not make mistakes. The sea has a memory, and it has a stomach. It eats what it wants." "What do you mean?" Edward asked. "A ship cannot just disappear." Silas leaned forward. He smelled like old tobacco and salt. In Crimson Bay, some things are real, and some things are shadows. You look at the water and see a path. I look at the water and see a grave. The light in my tower does not just show the way for ships. Sometimes, it shows the way for the dead. Edward felt uncomfortable. This man talked in riddles. "I found some names in the clinic," Edward said, watching the man's face closely. "Names like Mr. Jameson and Captain Miller. Do you know them?" Silas stopped moving his hands. He held the rope very tightly. His blue eyes became cold. "Those are names for the wind, Doctor. Do not look for people who are made of paper. If you keep digging in the sand, you will only find salt in your eyes." The old man stood up. He was taller than he looked when he was sitting. He pointed his finger at Edward. "The tide is coming in, Dr. Thorne. The water covers the truth every day. If I were you, I would stay in my clinic and fix broken fingers. Some mysteries are like the deep ocean. If you dive too deep, you can never come back up for air." Silas turned and walked toward the steep stairs that led up the cliff. He did not look back. Edward stayed on the beach for a long time. The wind became stronger, and the water began to move closer to his boots. He realized that Silas was not just a lighthouse keeper. He was a guard, and he was guarding a secret that was buried deep in the history of the bay. The wind on the beach grew colder as the sun began to set. The light was a pale, weak orange behind the thick clouds. Edward decided to walk back toward the village, but he stayed close to the water. The tide was going out now. The ocean was moving away from the land, leaving behind wet sand, green seaweed, and small pools of water between the rocks. Edward watched his feet as he walked. He liked the sound of the small stones moving under his boots. Suddenly, something bright caught his eye. It was a small flash of light near a large, dark rock. At first, he thought it was just a piece of wet glass or a shiny shell. He walked toward it and leaned down. Stuck in the wet sand was a small object. Edward reached out and pulled it free. It was a small box made of silver. It was heavy for its size. The silver was dark and dirty from the salt water, but it was still beautiful. He used his handkerchief to rub the dirt away. On the top of the box, there was an inscription in very fine, elegant letters. It read, "Gerard and Company, London." Edward knew that name. Gerard was a very famous and very expensive jeweler in London. They made jewelry for the wealthiest people in England. What was such an expensive item doing buried in the sand of a poor fishing village? He tried to open the box. The metal was stuck because of the salt. But Edward was a strong man. He pulled hard, and the lid opened. Inside, the box was lined with blue silk, though the silk was now wet and ruined. There was no gold or diamonds inside. Instead, there was a single piece of thick paper. The paper was folded carefully and kept dry by a thin layer of wax. Edward carefully unfolded the paper. The ink was faded, but he could still read the words. The handwriting was neat and formal. October 14th, 1882. The letter began. Edward's heart beat faster. That was the year the Mary Ann disappeared. He read the rest of the message. The storm is coming, and the light has gone out. We cannot reach the harbor. If we hit the rocks, the cargo must stay hidden. Look for the mark of the Red Cross under the western cliffs. The treasure of the Mary Ann belongs to the crown, not to the shadows of this bay. May God help us all. The letter was not signed. Edward stared at the paper. This was a message from the night of the ship's disappearance. It confirmed what Mrs. Gable had said. The lighthouse was dark that night. But it also suggested something more. The ship didn't just sink. It had a cargo that someone wanted to hide. He looked up at the high cliffs. The western cliffs were the ones directly below the lighthouse where Silas lived. The letter mentioned a red cross. Edward felt a mix of excitement and fear. This was real evidence. The stories of ghosts were just a cover for something very human and very greedy. He put the letter back in the silver box and hid it deep in his coat pocket. He looked around the beach. The fog was returning, thick and silent. He felt as if 100 eyes were watching him from the shadows of the rocks. He did not walk back to the village. He ran. He did not stop until he reached the warm, bright kitchen of Mrs. Gable's house. Edward sat at the small wooden desk in his room. The silver box sat in front of him. The candle on the table was short, and the light was weak. He held the old piece of paper carefully. The paper felt thin and dry, like an old leaf. He read the words again and again. The cargo must stay hidden. He whispered to himself. Edward was a man of medicine, not a man of gold. He did not care about treasure, but he cared about the truth. If the lighthouse was dark on purpose 10 years ago, then the ship did not hit the rocks by accident. It was a crime. A crime meant there were criminals, and those criminals might still be in Crimson Bay. He looked at the date on the letter. October 14th, 1882. He stood up and went to his medical kit. Inside the kit, he kept a small notebook where he wrote his daily thoughts. He looked for any information about the Mary Ann. He remembered something Dr. Aries said. The old doctor had mentioned that the village was different after that year. Edward looked out of his window. The moon was high now. The clouds were moving fast across the sky. He could see the western cliffs in the distance. They were tall and black against the sea. Somewhere on those cliffs, there was a red cross. Suddenly, Edward felt a strange sensation. He felt that someone was looking at him. He did not move his head. He used his eyes to look at the garden below his window. The garden was full of shadows and tall grass. In the corner of the garden, near a large stone wall, he saw a movement. A tall figure stood there. The person was very still. They wore a long, dark coat that reached their boots. Their face was hidden by a wide hat. It was the same figure the fisherman had described. Edward's heart began to beat very fast. He stayed very quiet. He did not want the person to know he was watching. The figure stood there for a long minute. Then, the person raised a hand and pointed at Edward's window. It was a slow, threatening movement. The person turned and walked away into the thick fog. They did not make a sound. There was no sound of footsteps on the grass. The garden was silent again. Edward closed the heavy curtains. He sat back down on his bed. His hands were shaking a little bit. He realized that the silver box was a dangerous object. Someone knew he had found it. The ghost of the bay was not a ghost at home in a storybook. It was a person who was watching his every move. He put the letter back into the silver box and hid the box under a loose floorboard near his bed. He blew out the candle. The room became very dark. He lay on the bed with his clothes on. He did not sleep. He watched the door and listened to the wind. He knew that tomorrow, he had to go to the cliffs. He had to find the Red Cross before the man in the black coat found him. The next morning, Edward felt very determined. He ate a quick breakfast of bread and cold meat. He did not tell Mrs. Gable where he was going. He put on his heavy boots and took his walking stick. He felt the weight of the silver box under the floorboard in his mind. He knew he had to be careful. He walked toward the western cliffs. The path was very narrow and steep. On his right side, there was a wall of black rock. On his left side, there was a long drop down to the ocean. The wind was much stronger here. It pushed against him, trying to move him toward the edge. The sound of the waves below was like a constant, heavy roar. Look for the mark of the Red Cross. He whispered to himself. He walked for an hour. He looked at every large stone and every dark corner of the cliff wall. The salt from the sea was in his eyes and on his lips. It was difficult to see clearly. Finally, he reached a place where the cliff moved inward. It was a small, quiet area protected from the wind. In the center of this area stood a very large, flat boulder. It was covered in green moss and gray lichen. Edward walked around the back of the boulder. He used his hand to rub away some of the moss. His heart jumped. Under the green moss, there was a mark. It was a cross, about the size of a man's hand. It was carved deep into the stone. He could still see a small amount of old, dark red paint inside the lines. This was it. This was the mark from the letter. Edward looked around the ground near the cross. The earth was hard and rocky. He did not see any treasure or boxes. He realized the cross was probably a sign. It was not the place where the cargo was hidden. It was a direction. He looked up at the cliff above the cross. High above him, on a ledge that looked impossible to reach, he saw a movement. A person was standing there. It was the man in the long black coat. He stood perfectly still on the very edge of the sharp rock. The wind pulled at his coat, making it look like the wings of a large, dark bird. He was looking directly down at Edward. "Hello," Edward shouted. His voice was small against the noise of the ocean. "Who are you? What do you want?" The man did not answer. He did not move at all. His face was a white blur in the distance. Edward felt a cold fear in his chest. He began to climb a small set of natural stone steps to get closer to the man. The rocks were slippery and wet. "Wait there," Edward called out again. But when Edward reached the next ledge and looked up, the man was gone. He had not run away. He had simply vanished into the grey mist of the higher cliffs. There was no sound of moving rocks and no sound of footsteps. The only thing Edward found on the ledge was a single, fresh footprint in a patch of soft mud. It was the footprint of a heavy leather boot. Edward realized the man was not a ghost. He was a man who knew these cliffs very well. He was watching the Red Cross, just like Edward. The doctor looked at the grey water below. He knew the mystery of the Marianne was not in the past. It was happening right now. The walk back to the village felt longer than before. The sky was now a deep, dark purple. The wind was even stronger, and it felt like it was pushing Edward away from the cliffs. He kept his hand in his pocket, touching the small silver box. He felt like he was carrying a heavy secret. His mind was full of questions. Who was the man in the black coat? Why was he watching the Red Cross? When Edward reached Mrs. Gable's house, the village was very silent. Most of the windows were dark. The people of Crimson Bay were already hiding in their homes. He opened the front door quietly. The house was warm, and the smell of dinner was still in the air. Mrs. Gable was not in the kitchen. He thought she was already asleep in her own room. Edward walked up the stairs to his bedroom. He wanted to sit down and think about the footprint he saw on the cliff. He pushed his door open and stepped inside. He did not light his lamp immediately. The room was dark, but there was a strange light coming from the floor. He struck a match and lit the candle on his desk. The small flame grew, and Edward gasped. His bedroom was a mess. His clothes were pulled out of his bag and thrown across the floor. His medical books were open and torn. But the most terrible thing was the large mirror on the wall. The mirror was broken into hundreds of small, sharp pieces. The glass was everywhere. It looked like a frozen lake that had been hit by a heavy stone. Edward's heart began to beat fast. He looked at the wall behind the broken mirror. Someone had used a piece of black coal to write a message on the white wallpaper. The letters were large and messy. "Leave before the tide." The message said. Edward felt a cold shiver run down his back. This was a direct threat. Someone had been in his room while he was at the cliffs. They were looking for something. He quickly knelt down by the floorboard near his bed. He pulled the wood up with his fingers. He felt a wave of relief. The silver box was still there. They had not found it. He stood up and looked at the message again. The tide. He whispered. He knew that the tide came in and out twice a day. But in this village, the tide meant something more. It meant the time when the ghosts came out. It meant the time when the secrets of the Marianne were moving under the water. He heard a soft noise in the hallway. It was the sound of a slow footstep on the old wood. Edward did not move. He held his breath. He looked at the door. The handle began to turn very, very slowly. Edward grabbed his heavy walking stick. He was not a violent man, but he was afraid. The door opened a few inches. A face appeared in the shadows. It was Mrs. Gable. Her face was pale, and her eyes were wide with surprise when she saw the room. "Doctor," she whispered. "I heard a noise, but I thought it was the wind. What happened here?" Edward looked at her. He wanted to trust her, but he remembered that she said her husband was part of the village's secrets years ago. In Crimson Bay, it was hard to know who was a friend and who was a shadow. Edward stood in the middle of his broken room. He looked at Mrs. Gable. She stood in the doorway. Her hands were pressed against her face. She looked at the broken glass on the floor. Then, she looked at the black letters on the wall. "Leave before the tide." "I did not hear anyone come into the house," Mrs. Gable said. Her voice was very thin. "I was in the kitchen. I was cleaning the plates. The wind was very loud. It was the only thing I heard." Edward watched her carefully. Her face was as white as a sheet of paper. She was shaking. He did not know if she was afraid for him or afraid of the person who did this. "Mrs. Gable, look at the wall," Edward said. He pointed at the message. "Who wrote this? Who wants me to leave Crimson Bay?" Mrs. Gable did not look at the wall. She looked at her feet instead. "I do not know, Doctor. Perhaps it was a person from the village. People here are very private. They do not like new people asking about the past. This is more than just a private village." "Mrs. Gable," Edward said firmly. "Someone broke my mirror. Someone searched my clothes. This is a crime. This is a threat to my life." Mrs. Gable moved closer to the door. She looked like she wanted to run away. "You should listen to the message, Dr. Thorne. This is a dangerous place for a man who wants to find the truth. The ocean is deep, and it keeps its secrets. You should take your bag and go back to London." "I cannot leave," Edward said. "I am the doctor here now. People are sick. And I want to know what happened to the Marianne. I want to know why Dr. Aries was so afraid." When he mentioned the name of the ship, Mrs. Gable made a small, sharp movement. She grabbed the edge of the door. "Do not speak that name." It brings bad luck to this house. My husband was a good man, but that ship changed everything. It is better to forget." "What did your husband do?" Edward asked. Mrs. Gable did not answer. She turned around quickly. "I must go. I must clean the kitchen. I will bring you a broom for the glass. But please, doctor, do not ask me more questions. I have a lot of work to do." She walked away down the hallway. Her footsteps were fast and heavy. Edward stayed in his room. He felt very alone. He knew Mrs. Gable was hiding something. She knew who wrote the message, but she was too afraid to say the name. He looked at the floorboard where the silver box was hidden. He was happy the thief did not find it. He realized that he could not trust anyone in the village yet. Everyone had a secret. Even the woman who gave him bread and tea was part of the mystery. Edward picked up a large piece of the broken mirror. He saw his own face in the glass. He looked tired, but his eyes were sharp. He was not going to leave. He was going to find the person in the black coat. Edward did not sleep well that night. Every time the wind pushed against the house, he sat up and looked at the door. In the morning, he decided to visit the most important man in the village, Mayor Sterling. If anyone could help find the person who broke the mirror, it was the mayor. The mayor lived in a large mansion on the other side of the village. It was a grand house made of red brick. It had many tall windows and a beautiful iron gate. It was much bigger and more expensive than any other house in Crimson Bay. Mayor Sterling was a very wealthy man because he owned the local fish canning factory. Most of the adults in the village worked for him. Edward walked up the long path to the front door. A servant in a clean uniform opened the door and led him to a large office. The room was full of expensive things. There were paintings of ships on the walls and a large rug from India on the floor. Mayor Sterling sat behind a heavy mahogany desk. He was a large man with a red face and a very expensive silk waistcoat. He smiled when he saw Edward, but the smile did not reach his eyes. His eyes were sharp and busy. "Ah, Dr. Thorne," the mayor said. His voice was loud and very friendly. "Please, sit down. I heard you arrived a few days ago. I am very happy to have a new doctor in our little village." "Thank you, Mayor Sterling," Edward said. He sat in a soft leather chair. "I wish I were here for a better reason. Someone broke into my room last night." The mayor stopped smiling. He leaned forward and put his hands on the desk. "Broke into your room? That is a very serious thing to say. Doctor, are you sure? Perhaps the wind broke the window. The storms here are very strong." "It was not the wind," Edward said firmly. "My mirror was broken from the inside, and someone wrote a message on my wall with coal. They told me to leave the village." The mayor laughed softly. It was a dry sound. "Do not worry, doctor. Some of the factory workers drink too much ale at the tavern. They are rough men, and they do not like strangers from London. They think you are here to change things. It was probably just a stupid joke by some bored adults." "It did not feel like a joke," Edward replied. "It felt like a threat." The mayor stood up and walked to the window. He looked out at the village. Crimson Bay is a quiet place. "Dr. Thorne, we like our peace. My advice to you is to ignore the message. Be a good doctor, help the sick, and do not ask about the past. If you do that, no one will bother you." Edward noticed that the mayor did not ask what the message said. He also did not ask if anything was stolen. He seemed to want the conversation to end quickly. "I will help the sick," Edward said. "But I also want to know why people are afraid of the lighthouse. And I want to know about the ship that disappeared 10 years ago." The mayor turned around. His face was no longer friendly. "That ship is at the bottom of the ocean. "Doctor, it is history, and history is best left buried. Now, if you will excuse me, I have a factory to run." Edward left the mansion. He felt a cold knot in his stomach. The mayor was too friendly at first, and too cold at the end. He realized the mayor was not going to help him. In fact, it felt like the mayor was also telling him to leave. Edward walked away from the mayor's mansion. The air was thick with the smell of coal smoke and wet earth. He did not go back to Mrs. Gable's house. He did not feel safe there. Instead, he went to the clinic. It was a cold, stone building, but it was his space. He needed to think about the names he saw in the locked cabinet. He entered the clinic and locked the heavy door behind him. He did not light the big lamp. He used a small candle and walked to the back of the room. The wooden cabinet was still there. He used the silver key to open the lock. The metal made a small, sharp sound. He pulled out the folders for Mr. Jameson and Captain Miller. "Who are these people?" he whispered. He sat at the desk. He looked for more papers. Under a stack of old medical journals, he found a small, black notebook. It was the personal diary of Dr. Aries. The pages were yellow and the ink was brown. He began to read. Most of the notes were about normal things. One page was about a woman with a cough. Another was about a man with a broken toe. But then, Edward found a page from 2 years ago, November 12th. The diary said, "Mr. Jameson came to the clinic today. He is the assistant at the lighthouse. He has a high fever. He is very nervous. He says he heard noises under the floor of the lighthouse. He thinks the ghosts are talking. I gave him medicine to sleep." Edward's heart jumped. Mr. Jameson was an assistant at the lighthouse. He looked at the next file. January 5th. The note continued. "Captain Miller visited. He is the man who brings the oil for the lighthouse lamp. He has a deep cut on his leg. He said he fell on the rocks near the western cliffs. He looked very afraid. He asked me if the mayor knows about his injury." Edward put the papers down. He felt a cold sweat on his forehead. These men were real. They were not made of paper like Silas said, but they were all connected to the lighthouse. And they were all connected to the mayor. He looked at the files again. There were 5 names in total. Every man on the list had a job at the lighthouse or worked on the supply boats. And every man had a note next to his name. No longer in village. Where did they go? Did they leave because they were afraid? Or did something happen to them? Edward looked at his own file again. It was still empty. Was he the next person on the list? Was he going to become a shadow too? Suddenly, he heard a sound outside. It was the sound of a heavy object hitting the ground. Then, he heard the sound of the wooden shed door opening. The shed was just 10 feet away from the clinic window. Edward blew out his candle. The room became pitch black. He moved to the window and moved the curtain just a little bit. In the pale moonlight, he saw a man. The man was carrying a large wooden crate. He was walking toward the shed. It was not the man in the black coat. This man was shorter. He wore a factory worker's apron. He put the crate inside the shed and locked the door. Then, he looked around. He looked at the clinic window for a long time. Edward stayed very still. He did not even breathe. After a minute, the man walked away into the fog. Edward realized the clinic was not just a place for medicine. It was a place where people were watched. The files were not medical records. They were a list of people who knew too much. Edward felt a deep hunger in his stomach. He had not eaten since breakfast, and the cold air of the clinic made his bones ache. He decided to go to the village tavern. It was called the Anchor. It was a small, low building near the harbor. He hoped that a warm meal and the presence of other adults would make him feel less alone. When he opened the heavy wooden door of the tavern, a cloud of warm, grey smoke hit his face. The room was dark and smelled of roasted meat and strong ale. There was a large fireplace in the centre of the room. A group of men sat around the fire. They were factory workers and fishermen. They were talking in low voices. When Edward walked in, the talking stopped for a moment. Many pairs of eyes looked at him. Then, the men returned to their drinks. Edward sat at a small, sticky table in a dark corner. A woman with a tired face brought him a bowl of thick beef stew and a piece of bread. He began to eat. The stew was hot and good. As he ate, he stayed very quiet. He wanted to listen to the people around him. Two men sat at the table next to him. They wore the grey aprons of Mayor Sterling's factory. They did not see Edward in the shadows. They were leaning close together, whispering, "Is the shipment ready?" The first man asked. "Yes." The second man answered. "The crates are in the shed behind the clinic. We moved the last one an hour ago. The boat will come to the western cliffs when the moon is high." Edward stopped moving his spoon. He felt a sharp jolt of excitement. They were talking about the crate he saw earlier. "What about the doctor?" The first man whispered. "He is staying right next to the shed. He is a curious man. He asks too many questions about the Mary Ann." The second man laughed. It was a cold, mean sound. "The mayor is not worried about the doctor. If the doctor sees too much, he will go the same way as Mr. Jameson. No one stays in Crimson Bay if they don't follow the rules." Edward's hand shook. He put his spoon down quietly. He realized that Mr. Jameson did not leave the village by choice. He felt a wave of fear, but also a wave of anger. These men were part of a secret plan, and the mayor was their leader. "The tide is at midnight." The first man said, "We must meet Silas at the lighthouse. He will give the signal when the water is deep enough. This is the biggest shipment of the year. The French wine and the silk will make the mayor very rich." "And us?" the other asked. "We get our gold, as always. Just keep your mouth shut and your eyes open for the ghost." The two men stood up. They finished their drinks and walked out of the tavern. Edward waited for a minute. He felt the silver box in his pocket. He knew what he had to do. He had to follow them. He had to see the secret shipment with his own eyes. He stood up and left the tavern. The night air was freezing. The fog was so thick that he could only see a few feet in front of him. He looked toward the cliffs. Somewhere in that darkness, a boat was coming. Edward walked away from the tavern. He did not go to the clinic. He went back to Mrs. Gable's house. He needed his lamp and his heavy coat. The air near the harbor was freezing, and the fog was like a thick, wet wall. He walked quietly on the grass so nobody could hear his boots on the stone. He entered the house and went straight to his room. He did not see Mrs. Gable. He grabbed a small metal lamp and some matches. He also took his heavy walking stick. He looked at the floorboard. The silver box was still safe. He felt a little bit of hope. If he could find the shipment, he could prove the mayor was a criminal. Edward went out the back door of the house. Behind the house, there was a large hill with many dry bushes and old trees. He remembered something Mrs. Gable said about her husband. She said he was part of the secret years ago. Edward thought, if her husband was a smuggler, he needed a way to get to the sea quickly and quietly. He began to look for a path. He moved the dry bushes with his stick. The branches made a loud, scraping noise, but there was no one around to hear. After searching for 20 minutes, he found something. Behind a large, flat rock, there was a narrow opening in the ground. It was hidden by long, yellow grass. Edward lit his lamp. The yellow flame showed a small set of stairs made of rough stone. The stairs went deep into the earth. They were very old and very slippery. Edward breathed deeply and started to go down. The air inside the path was different. It did not smell like salt. It smelled like cold stone and wet dirt. He had to move slowly. The walls were very close to his shoulders. He felt like the earth was pressing against him. After walking down for a long time, the path became flat. He followed the tunnel. He heard a low, heavy sound. It was the sound of the ocean, but it was coming from below him. The tunnel was leading him toward the cliffs. Suddenly, the tunnel opened into a very large space. Edward stopped and held his lamp high. He was in a massive cave. The roof of the cave was very high, and the walls were black. On one side of the cave, there was a large opening that looked out at the sea. The water was coming into the cave. This was a secret harbor. In the middle of the cave, Edward saw something. It was a small rowing boat. The boat was sitting on the sand. Edward walked toward it. He touched the wood of the boat. It was very wet. There was a small amount of water inside the boat, too. Someone used this tonight. Edward whispered. He looked around the cave. He saw many wooden crates stacked against the wall. They were the same crates he saw in the shed behind the clinic. He realized this cave was the center of the mystery. The hidden path led from the village directly to the smuggler's cave. He was now standing in the heart of the ghost's home. Suddenly, he heard a voice. It was coming from the opening near the sea. He quickly blew out his lamp and hid behind a large rock. Edward pressed his back against the cold, wet rock. His heart was beating so loudly that he was afraid the men would hear it. He stayed very still in the darkness. He could smell the salt and the old wood of the boat. The voices became louder. 2 men were walking into the cave from the sea entrance. They were carrying a small metal lantern. The light moved across the walls, but Edward stayed in the deep shadows. The tide is high enough now, a man said. Edward recognized the voice. It was one of the men from the tavern. We need to move these crates into the boat. The mayor wants them at the lighthouse before the sun comes up. Is Silas ready? The second man asked. He is always ready. He likes the gold too much to be late. The men began to move the heavy wooden crates. Edward heard the sound of wood scraping against the sand. He heard the men breathing hard as they lifted the heavy boxes into the small rowing boat. They worked quickly. They did not talk much. They seemed like men who had done this many times before. After a few minutes, the boat was full. The men pushed the boat toward the water. Edward watched them through a small crack in the rocks. The water reached their knees. They jumped into the boat and began to row. The sound of the wooden oars hitting the water was slow and steady. The light from their lantern became smaller and smaller as they moved out of the cave and into the dark bay. When the light was gone, Edward breathed a sigh of relief. He waited for a long time to be sure they were not coming back. Then, he stood up and lit his own lamp again. He walked over to the place where the boat had been sitting. On the sand, he saw something small and dark. He leaned down and picked it up. It was a piece of thick, black cloth. It was very heavy and felt like expensive wool. It was a piece of a long coat. The man on the cliff. Edward whispered, "This belongs to him." He looked at the floor of the cave again. Near the wall, he saw a small piece of wood that was not part of a crate. It was a broken piece of a ship's nameplate. It was old and covered in salt, but Edward could still see 3 letters painted in white. M.A.R. His hands began to shake. This was a piece of the Marianne. The ship did not just disappear 10 years ago. It was here, in this cave. The cargo was taken, and the ship was broken into pieces. The ghost of the bay was a cover for a group of thieves who had been stealing from ships for a long time. Edward realized he was in a very dangerous place. If the men returned and found him with a piece of the ship, They would not let him leave. He looked at the hidden path behind him. He needed to get back to the clinic. He needed to find a way to tell the law in London about the mayor and the cave. Edward climbed back up the hidden stone stairs. His legs were tired, and his heart was still racing. When he reached the top, he carefully moved the dry bushes back into place. He walked to the clinic and went inside. He did not sleep. He sat at his desk and looked at the piece of black cloth and the broken wood from the ship. He was certain now. The mayor and his men were using the old cave to hide stolen goods. The next morning, the fog was very thick. It was difficult to see the other side of the street. Edward was making a pot of tea when he heard a loud, urgent banging on the clinic door. He opened it quickly. A man in a suit stood there. He looked very worried. "Doctor, come quickly." The man said, "I am the mayor's clerk. Mr. Webb, the mayor's chief assistant, is very ill. He cannot get out of bed." Edward grabbed his medical bag. He followed the clerk through the village to a small, expensive house near the factory. Inside, the house was very quiet and very warm. The smell of expensive tobacco filled the air. They went up to the second floor and entered a large bedroom. Mr. Webb was lying in a big bed with white sheets. He was a thin man with sharp features. Usually, he was very proud and serious, but now his face was bright red. He was sweating, and his eyes were closed. He was making a low, pained sound in his throat. "How long has he been like this?" Edward asked the clerk. "Since early this morning, Doctor. He came home late last night and looked very pale. This morning, he could not speak." Edward sat on the edge of the bed. He touched Mr. Webb's forehead. It was very hot. He checked the man's pulse. It was fast and weak. Edward then looked at the man's body for any signs of injury. He pulled back the sleeve of Mr. Webb's nightshirt. His heart stopped. On Mr. Webb's left arm, there was a thick white bandage. The bandage was wet with blood and a strange yellow fluid. Edward carefully removed the cloth. Underneath, he saw the same wound he had seen on the fisherman. It was a circle of small, deep holes. The skin around the bite was a dark, angry purple. "What is this?" the clerk asked, looking over Edward's shoulder. "It is a bite," Edward said. His voice was very low. "A very bad one. Mr. Webb, can you hear me?" "What bit you?" Mr. Webb opened his eyes slowly. He looked at Edward, but his eyes did not seem to see him. He looked past Edward, at the dark corner of the room. He began to shake. "The shadow," Webb whispered. His voice was like the sound of dry leaves. "The shadow in the lighthouse. It was hungry. I didn't move fast enough." "Was it a man?" Edward asked, leaning close. "Was it a man in a black coat?" Webb did not answer. He started to cough. He closed his eyes again and fell into a deep, feverish sleep. The clerk looked at Edward with wide eyes. What did he mean? "Doctor." "What shadow?" "I don't know yet," Edward said. He began to clean the wound. "But this illness is not a normal fever. It is a poison, and it is coming from the same place as the ghost." Edward realized something important. The ghost was not just scaring the villagers. It was attacking the mayor's own men. Something was going wrong with their secret plan. Edward left Mr. Webb's house with a heavy heart. The village felt even colder than before. The mist moved around his legs like a living thing. He walked quickly back to the clinic. He needed to find more information. If the ghost was attacking the mayor's men, there was a reason. He needed to understand what happened 10 years ago. He entered the clinic and went straight to the bookshelf. He began to pull down every book. He looked for anything written by Dr. Aries. Most of the books were about medicine, but some were personal records. Finally, At the very back of a bottom shelf, he found a heavy book with a dark green cover. It was the official medical journal of Crimson Bay. Edward sat at his desk and opened the book. He turned the pages slowly. Each page had a date and a list of patients. He saw names of people who had lived and died in the village for years. He turned the pages faster, looking for the year 1882. He found the month of September. He saw the normal records of coughs and injuries. Then he found the start of October. His heart began to beat faster. He turned to the page for October 14th. He stopped. His eyes went wide. The page for October 14th was not there. In fact, 3 pages were gone. Someone had used a small, sharp knife to cut the pages out of the book. The edges of the paper were white and clean. Someone didn't want the truth to be found, Edward whispered. He looked closely at the spine of the book. A tiny piece of the torn paper was still stuck in the middle. He used a pair of small medical tweezers to pull it out. It was a very small scrap of paper, only the size of a postage stamp. There was only one word written on it in Dr. Ariz's shaky handwriting. The word was lighthouse. Next to the word, there was a small drawing of a star. Edward stared at it. Why would a doctor write about a lighthouse in a medical journal? A doctor writes about people and diseases. Edward realized that Dr. Aries must have treated someone from the Marianne that night. If the ship disappeared, and the people disappeared, then why did the doctor have a record? The answer was simple. Some people did not disappear. Someone survived. And Dr. Aries had seen them at the lighthouse. He looked at the empty space where the pages used to be. The person who tore these pages wanted to hide the fact that there were survivors. If there were survivors, they could tell the truth about the cargo and the dark lighthouse. Edward stood up and looked out the window. The tall tower of the lighthouse stood on the cliff, surrounded by fog. It looked like a giant finger pointing at the sky. He knew the answer to the mystery was inside that tower. Silas, the mayor, and the man in the black coat were all part of the same dark story. He put the scrap of paper in his pocket. He felt a new sense of danger. If the person who tore the pages knew he had the journal, they would come for him. He was no longer just a doctor. He was a witness to a crime that was 10 years old. Edward felt he needed fresh air. The clinic was full of old secrets and dusty books. He decided to walk down to the harbor. The sea wall was a very long, low wall made of heavy grey stones. It was built many years ago to protect the village from the big waves of the ocean. The stones were covered in green moss and white salt from the water. He walked slowly along the wall. The wind was very strong there. It made a low, whistling sound in his ears. He looked down at the dark water. The tide was moving out, leaving the wet rocks visible. Suddenly, he saw a small flash of light. It was stuck between 2 large stones near the bottom of the wall. Edward climbed down the side of the wall carefully. The stones were slippery and cold. He reached into a small hole between the rocks. His fingers touched something hard. He pulled it out and held it up to the grey light. It was a gold coin. It was very heavy and thick. He rubbed the dirt and salt off with his thumb. The coin was not from England. It did not have the face of the Queen on it. Instead, it had the face of a man with a crown and long, curly hair. There were words written around the edge in a language he did not speak well, but he recognized the style. It was French. "This is a very old French gold coin," Edward whispered to himself. He remembered the men in the tavern. They had talked about a shipment of French wine and silk. But this coin looked much older than 10 years. It looked like it belonged to a king from a long time ago. Why was it hidden here, in the wall of a small English village? He heard a soft sound behind him. A small stone moved and hit the water. He turned around quickly. A man was standing at the top of the sea wall, looking down at him. It was the station master, the man who had met him on his first night. He was wearing his dark blue coat and a flat cap. He did not look happy. "It is dangerous to climb on the wall, Doctor," the station master said. His voice was deep and very serious. "The waves are strong today. A man can easily fall and never be found." Edward closed his hand over the gold coin. He did not want the man to see it. "I was just looking at the ocean," Edward said. "I wanted to see the tide move." The station master did not move. He watched Edward climb back up to the path. His eyes were like two cold pieces of glass. "The ocean takes many things, Dr. Thorne. But it does not like to give them back. You should go back to the village. It is safer there." Edward walked past the man. He felt a cold shiver on his skin. He realized that the station master was not just worried about his safety. He was watching him. Every person in a position of power in Crimson Bay seemed to be part of a secret circle. The gold coin in his pocket felt very heavy. It was more proof that the ghosts of the bay were actually men with a lot of stolen gold. The evening was long and quiet. Edward went back to Mrs. Gable's house. He did not talk to her. He went straight to his room and locked the door. He sat at his desk and looked at the objects he had found. He had a piece of a ship, a bit of a black coat, a torn scrap of paper, and a heavy gold coin. These were the pieces of a puzzle. He just needed to put them together. The wind was very loud outside. It hit the side of the house like a giant hand. Rain began to fall. The sound of the rain on the roof was fast and heavy. Edward did not light his candle. He did not want anyone to know he was awake. He sat in the dark and looked out of his large window. In the distance, the lighthouse was visible. Usually, the big lamp at the top turned in a slow, steady circle. It was a rhythmic light that helped ships see the land. But tonight, the light was different. Edward stood up and moved closer to the glass. He watched the light very carefully. It was not turning. Instead, it was flashing. The light went on, then off. Then it went on for a long time. Then it was dark again. "That is not a mistake," Edward whispered. "That is a signal." He grabbed a piece of paper and a pen. He used the pale light of the moon to see. Every time the lighthouse flashed, he made a mark on the paper. A short flash was a dot. A long flash was a line. He had seen sailors do this in London. It was a way to talk over long distances. The flashes were fast. On, off, on, off, long on. Edward watched for 10 minutes. The lighthouse stopped flashing, then started the same pattern again. It was a message. But who was the message for? He looked down at the dark water of the bay. He could not see anything because of the rain and the fog. But then, he saw a tiny, weak light on the water. It was very far away. It was a small lamp on a boat. The boat gave 2 short flashes of light in return. Edward felt a chill that was not from the cold. The lighthouse was talking to a ship out at sea. Silas was the person in the lighthouse. He was the one sending the message. He was telling the ship that it was safe to come closer. Suddenly, the lighthouse light turned back to its normal circle. The small light on the water disappeared. The signal was over. Edward looked at the marks on his paper. He did not know the code perfectly, but he knew enough. The patterns were repeating. Someone was coming to Crimson Bay tonight. And they were not coming to the harbor. They were coming to the secret cave under the cliffs. He looked at the gold coin on his desk. He realized that the shipment the men talked about in the tavern was arriving. This was the moment the mayor was waiting for. Edward knew he could not stay in his room. He had to see what was on that boat. He had to see who was meeting Silas. He put on his coat and grabbed his lamp. He did not use the front door. He climbed out of the low window onto the roof of the kitchen and dropped quietly to the wet grass below. He moved into the shadows of the trees, heading toward the cliffs one more time. Edward crouched behind a thick pine tree near the edge of the cliff. The rain was cold and felt like needles on his skin. He held his notebook under his coat to keep the paper dry. He had many marks on the page, short dots and long lines. He was a doctor, but before his medical studies, he had spent time at the London docks. There, he had watched sailors send messages across the dark water using light. He sat on a wet stone and used his small lamp. He shielded the light with his hand so no one could see him from the lighthouse. He looked at the first group of marks. He tried to remember the alphabet of the sea. Dot, dash, dot, dot, he whispered. That is the letter L. He worked slowly. His fingers were cold and stiff. It was difficult to hold the pen. He translated the next few marks. One by one, letters began to form words on the wet paper. The first word was cargo. The second word was ready. Edward felt a chill that was not from the rain. The lighthouse was not helping ships avoid the rocks. It was telling a secret ship that the stolen goods were ready for pickup. But the message did not stop there. The lighthouse lamp flashed again in a long, complex pattern. Edward watched and wrote. He translated the next sentence. His heart began to beat fast against his ribs. The paper now said, "The doctor is watching." Edward froze. He looked up at the tall, dark tower of the lighthouse. Silas was up there. Did Silas see him? Did the man in the black coat see him through a telescope? He felt like 1,000 eyes were looking at him from the darkness of the trees. They knew he was not just a doctor anymore. They knew he was a witness. They are talking about me, he thought. They know I am here on the cliffs. He realized he was in a very dangerous position. The smugglers were not just a group of poor fishermen. They were organized, and they had a way to communicate with ships far out at sea. If they knew he was watching, they would try to stop him. He remembered the message on his wall, "Leave before the tide." The tide was high now. The time for warnings was over. He looked back at the lighthouse. The light was now a steady, spinning beam again. The secret conversation was finished. He needed to find out more about this code. He remembered seeing a large collection of maritime books in Mayor Sterling's mansion. The mayor had books about every ship that visited the bay. Perhaps there was a book about secret signals there. Edward put his notebook back into his pocket. He decided he could not go back to his room yet. He needed to be brave. He had to find a way to stop the next shipment. If the cargo was ready, then the crime was about to happen again. He stood up, his legs shaking from the cold, and began to move quietly away from the cliff. He did not go toward his house. He went toward the large, red brick mansion of the mayor. Edward walked toward the large red brick house. The iron gate was heavy and cold. He pushed it slowly. The metal made a long, high-pitched scraping sound against the stone floor. He stopped and waited, but the house remained silent. He moved through the garden, hiding behind the tall, dark bushes. He saw a window with a bright yellow light on the ground floor. He moved closer to the glass and looked inside. Mayor Sterling was there. He was not alone. The station master stood across from him. They looked very serious. The mayor was pointing at a large paper map on his heavy desk. They were talking quietly, but Edward could not hear their words through the thick glass. He saw the mayor hit the desk with his hand. The station master nodded and walked toward the door. Edward knew this was his chance. He knew the mayor's mansion had a very large library at the back of the building. He went to the side of the house and found a small wooden door. This was the entrance for the servants. He turned the handle. It was unlocked. He stepped inside and closed the door very quietly. The hallway was dark and smelled of expensive wax. Edward walked on the soft rug, making no sound with his boots. He passed a tall grandfather clock. The heavy metal weight inside the clock moved back and forth with a steady, rhythmic sound. He found the library at the end of the hall. It was a massive room with walls covered in books. The ceiling was very high. He moved his small lamp across the shelves. He saw books about history, law, and medicine. Finally, he found a section with books about the sea. There were books about the stars, maps of the English coast, and the history of the British Navy. He looked for a book about signals. His eyes stopped on a thin book with a blue leather cover. The title was The Mariner's Secret Language, a Guide to Light and Sound. He pulled it down and opened it. He used the light of his lamp to see the pages. He found a chapter called Private Codes and Smuggling Signals. Edward pulled his notebook out of his pocket. He compared his dots and lines to the symbols in the book. His heart beat faster. The code he saw from the lighthouse was not a standard naval code. It was an old, secret language used by traders in France and England many years ago. He read the translation for a long dash followed by a short. It meant hidden. He read the translation for 3 short flashes. It meant treasure. Suddenly, he heard the sound of heavy footsteps in the hallway. The mayor was walking toward the library. Edward heard the sound of a metal key hitting the floor. He quickly blew out his lamp. The room became pitch black. He felt the cold air from the hallway as the library door began to open. Edward moved behind a large velvet curtain near the window. He stayed very still, holding the book against his chest. The door to the library opened fully. A bright light from the hallway spilled across the floor. Edward stayed perfectly still behind the heavy velvet curtain. He did not breathe. He could smell the thick, sweet scent of the mayor's cigar. The mayor walked into the room. His heavy leather boots made a rhythmic noise on the wooden floor. The mayor did not light the lamps in the library. He walked to his large desk and began to move some papers. He seemed angry. He was whispering to himself. But Edward could not understand the words. After a minute, the mayor grabbed a small metal object from the desk. It made a sharp sound as he put it into his pocket. Then, he turned around and walked out of the room. He closed the heavy door with a loud, firm sound. Edward waited for a long time. The house became silent again, except for the steady ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. He stepped out from behind the curtain. His hands were shaking, but he held the blue leather book tightly. He sat on the floor in the dark corner and opened his notebook. He looked at the marks he had written down on the cliff. With the help of the mariner's secret language, he began to translate the long sequence of flashes. He worked slowly, moving his finger across the page of the book. The first part of the message was clear now. The ship is near the western rocks. Edward felt a cold sweat on his neck. He moved to the next group of symbols. This part was more difficult because it used a special combination of dots and lines. He found the matching symbols in the private codes chapter. He translated the words one by one. Cargo is ready. Then, he reached the final part of the signal. This was the part that had looked so complex from the cliff. As he translated the last few symbols, his blood felt like ice. The message said, "The doctor is watching. He knows too much. Stop him." Edward dropped his pen. It made a soft sound on the rug. He was not just a witness to a crime anymore. He was a target. Silas and the mayor were not just talking to a ship. They were talking about him. They knew he was on the cliffs. They knew he was looking for the truth. He realized that every moment he stayed in the mansion was a moment of great danger. The mayor was not a friend. He was the leader of a group of dangerous men who would do anything to protect their gold. They had probably hurt Mr. Jameson and Captain Miller because those men also knew too much. Edward stood up. He put the blue book back on the shelf. He had to be careful to put it in the exact same spot. He moved to the small servant's door. He opened it slowly and looked out. The garden was dark and full of shadows. The rain had stopped, but the trees were still dripping water. He needed a plan. He could not go to the police in the village because the station master was part of the circle. He needed to find a way to get help from outside Crimson Bay. But first, he needed to find the one thing that could prove the mayor's guilt. He remembered the small metal object the mayor took from his desk. It looked like a key. Edward stood in the silence of the library. He knew he had to move fast. The mayor was gone, but he might come back. The room felt heavy with secrets. Edward walked to the large mahogany desk. He moved his small lamp across the surface. There were many papers, a bottle of dark ink, and a silver pen. He remembered the sound of metal hitting the floor when the mayor was in the room. He looked down at the rug. Near the edge of the desk, something bright caught the light. He leaned down and picked it up. It was a small brass key. It was old and heavy. The top of the key had a special shape. It looked like a small, stylized flame. "This is not a normal house key," Edward whispered. He held the key in his hand. He remembered the door of the lighthouse. He had seen Silas use a similar key a few days ago. This key was the way into the tower. If he had this key, he could enter the lighthouse when Silas was away. He could find the evidence of the secret signals and the stolen cargo. He looked at the papers on the desk one more time. He saw a map of the bay. There were red circles around the western cliffs and the hidden cave. Next to the map, there was a list of numbers. Edward realized these were the dates of the tides. The mayor was planning the next shipment. According to the list, the biggest shipment was happening in 2 nights. Suddenly, Edward heard a voice in the hallway. It was the mayor again. He was talking to a servant. "I cannot find my desk key, Robert," the mayor said. His voice was loud and angry. "I must have dropped it in the library. Bring a lamp. We must find it now." Edward's heart jumped. He looked at the brass key in his hand. This was the key the mayor was looking for. He could not leave it on the floor, and he could not put it back on the desk. If he kept it, the mayor would know someone was in the room. But if he gave it back, he would lose his only chance to enter the lighthouse. He made a quick decision. He put the brass key deep into his pocket. He looked around the room. There was no time to use the door. The footsteps were very close now. He saw a large window behind the desk. It was locked, but the lock was simple. He turned the metal handle quietly. He pushed the window open. The cold, wet air of the night rushed into the room. He climbed onto the window ledge. He looked down. There was a garden with soft grass below. He jumped. He landed on his feet and rolled into the bushes. He stayed very still. A moment later, the library door opened. The bright light of a lamp filled the room. He saw the shadow of the mayor move across the ceiling. "The window is open," the mayor shouted. Someone was here. "Robert, get the men. Search the garden." Edward did not wait. He ran through the dark garden. He moved past the trees and the stone walls. He did not look back. He climbed over the iron gate and ran toward the village. The rain began to fall again, covering the sound of his footsteps. He held the brass key tightly in his pocket. He was no longer just a doctor. He was a thief. But he had the key to the truth. Edward reached the clinic, his chest heaving. He didn't dare go back to Mrs. Gable's house. It would be the first place the mayor's men would look. He slipped into the clinic and locked the door, leaning against the cold wood. His heart felt like a trapped bird hitting its wings against his ribs. He didn't light a lamp. Instead, he navigated the room by memory. He needed to hide the brass key. If they caught him with the key to the lighthouse, his story was over. He felt for the loose floorboard under the desk where he had hidden his other findings. He slid the brass key, the gold coin, and the scrap of paper inside. Suddenly, the sound of heavy boots echoed on the cobblestones outside. "Check the clinic," a voice shouted. It was the station master. The doctor has been acting strange. If he's not in his bed at Gables, he's here. Edward froze. He looked around the dark room. There was nowhere to hide. The clinic was a single room with a small curtained area for examinations. He noticed the heavy wooden cabinet he had unlocked earlier. It was tall enough for a man to stand in if he moved the files. He scrambled toward it, pulled out a stack of folders, and stepped inside. He pulled the doors shut just as the front door of the clinic was kicked open. The sound of footsteps filled the room. The beam of a lantern swept across the floor, the light peeking through the thin cracks in the cabinet doors. "He's not here," a man grumbled. "The lamp is still warm," the station master said. Edward heard the man's hand brush against the desk right next to his hiding spot. "He's nearby. Look in the shed. Check the garden." Edward held his breath. He felt a sharp pain in his leg from the cramped position. Through the crack in the cabinet door, he saw the station master's silhouette. The man wasn't looking for a doctor. He was looking for a thief. He watched as the station master picked up a medical book from the desk, looked at it for a moment, and then threw it back down in frustration. "Mayor says he wants him found before the tide turns." The station master muttered, "If the doctor sees the Mary Ann tonight, we're all going to the gallows." Edward's blood ran cold. The Mary Ann. The ship from 10 years ago. The men in the tavern said a shipment was coming, but they hadn't mentioned the ship by name. How could a ship that sank a decade ago be returning tonight? The men finally left, their boots fading into the distance. Edward waited for what felt like hours before he pushed the cabinet doors open. He was shaking, not just from the cold, but from the realization of what he had heard. He realized he needed to understand the lighthouse better. If the Mary Ann was returning, the lighthouse was the center of it all. He pulled out the blue leather book he had taken from the library and looked for a diagram of the tower. He needed to know where Silas would be hiding. The lighthouse was more than just a tower. It was a fortress. The lantern room at the top was where the signals were sent, but the service rooms below held the machinery, and potentially the stolen cargo. Edward looked at the brass key in his hand. It wasn't just a key to a door. It was a key to the truth. The storm reached its peak as Edward stepped out of the clinic. The rain was no longer a drizzle. It was a deluge that turned the village paths into small, rushing rivers. He kept his head down, his medical bag slung tight across his chest. Inside, nestled among the bandages and tinctures, lay the brass key and his notebook. The climb to the lighthouse was treacherous. The path was a narrow ribbon of mud and jagged rock that clung to the face of the cliff. To his left, the Atlantic Ocean was a churning cauldron of white foam and black water. The wind screamed through the crags, sounding less like air and more like a chorus of the drowned. Edward's lungs burned. Every step was a battle against the elements. He reached the base of the lighthouse, a massive cylinder of granite that seemed to grow straight out of the cliffside. There was no light in the lower windows. The only illumination came from the great rotating beam far above, slicing through the clouds like a giant sword. He reached the heavy iron door. It was cold, wet, and smelled of ancient rust. His hands were numb, making it difficult to find the keyhole. He fumbled with the brass key, his heart hammering against his ribs. The bolt slid back. Edward pushed the door open and slipped inside, leaning his weight against it to close it against the gale. The sudden silence was deafening. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of whale oil, salt, and something metallic, like the scent of blood or old iron. He lit a small match. The flickering flame revealed a spiral stone staircase that wound upward into the darkness. "Silas," Edward whispered. His voice was swallowed by the thick stone walls. There was no answer. He began to climb. The stairs were worn in the center from decades of use. As he reached the second level, he found the service room. It was filled with heavy machinery, gears and weights that kept the great light turning. He noticed something strange on the floor. It wasn't oil. It was a trail of dark, wet footprints leading toward a small wooden door at the back of the room. Edward followed them. He pushed the door open and found himself in a small storage area. Stacked from floor to ceiling were the crates from the cave. But these were open. Inside, he didn't see wine or silk. He saw something much more valuable, and much more dangerous. Row 1. Cases of antique silver chalices. Row 2. Bundles of high-grade gunpowder. Row 3. Small, heavy boxes filled with the same French gold coins he had found in the seawall. This isn't just smuggling. Edward realized. This is a treasury. He heard a floorboard creak above him. Then, a low, melodic whistling began. It was a sea shanty, the same one he had heard the fisherman humming in the tavern. The sound was coming from the lantern room at the very top. Edward gripped his walking stick. He knew he had to reach the top. He had to see who was sending the signals. He began to climb the final set of iron rungs, the metal cold as ice under his palms. As his head cleared the floor of the lantern room, he saw a figure standing by the glass, looking out at the black horizon. It was not Silas. The figure was tall and thin, wearing the long, expensive black coat. The man didn't turn around. He was looking at a small light far out at sea, a light that was getting closer with every passing minute. "You're late for the surgery, doctor," the man said. The voice was smooth, cultured, and terrifyingly familiar. Edward stepped onto the floor, his eyes widening. "You?" The man slowly turned around. The rotating beam of the lighthouse swept behind him, casting his shadow long and jagged across the iron floor. As the light hit his face, Edward felt a coldness in his marrow that the storm outside couldn't match. It was Dr. Aries, but he didn't look like the tired, broken old man the villagers described. He stood tall, his eyes sharp and burning with an unsettling intelligence. His long black coat was dry, suggesting he had been here for a long time, watching the bay through the thick glass. "Dr. Aries." Edward breathed, his voice barely audible over the hum of the rotating machinery. "They told me you had left. They said you were too old to continue." Aries smiled, a thin, surgical line that didn't reach his eyes. "In a way, I did leave. Edward." The man who sat in that dusty clinic was a ghost. "This," he gestured to the tower and the crates below, "is my true practice. You see, a doctor's job is to extract things that shouldn't be there. For 10 years, I've been extracting the wealth of the Atlantic." "The Marianne," Edward said, gripping the railing. "You didn't just fail to save them. You lured them in. You turned off the light." Aries stepped closer. He held a strange, metallic device in his hand, a small, spring-loaded tool with 4 sharp, needle-like spikes. The ghost of Crimson Bay is a necessary legend. It keeps the curious at home and the disobedient quiet. The bite marks on the fisherman. On Mr. Webb. Just a small reminder of what happens when one looks too closely at the cargo. The massive Fresnel lens behind Aries groaned as it spun, its prisms magnifying the light into a blinding white glare. The Marianne was carrying the treasury of an exiled French duke. Aries continued, his voice calm, as if he were discussing a common cold. Gold, jewels, and documents that would change the history of Europe. The mayor, Silas, the station master. We all took our piece. But the ship didn't sink. We brought her into the hidden cave, dismantled her, and we have been selling her piece by piece ever since. "And the crew?" Edward asked, though he already knew the answer. Aris's expression darkened. "The sea has a memory, as Silas likes to say, but dead men have none. You, however, have been a most difficult patient. Edward, you found the silver box. You found the key. You've diagnosed the problem. But unfortunately, there is only one cure for a doctor who knows too much. Ares raised the spiked tool. Outside, a massive flare of red light erupted on the horizon. The ship was here. The final shipment of the Marianne's gold was arriving, and the ghost was ready to protect his hoard. Edward realized he was trapped at the top of the world, with a murderer in front of him and 100-foot drop behind him. But he still had the heavy walking stick in his hand, and he had something Ares didn't: the truth. The village knows. Ares. Edward lied, his voice steady. I sent a letter to the London police 3 days ago. If I don't return, they won't just find a ghost. They'll find you. Ares paused, his eyes flickering with a moment of doubt. In that second, the lighthouse lights swung around, blinding them both. The blinding glare of the Fresnel lens passed, leaving red spots in Edward's vision. But he didn't wait for his eyes to adjust. He lunged forward, swinging his heavy walking stick. It connected with Ares's shoulder with a sickening sound. The spiked tool clattered to the iron floor. Ares snarled, his refined mask finally shattering into a face of pure, animalistic rage. He didn't reach for his tool, he reached for Edward's throat. They crashed against the inner railing, the rotating gears of the great light groaning beside them. The tower shook as a massive wave slammed into the cliffs below. You think you're a hero? Ares hissed, his hands tightening around Edward's collar. You're just a replacement. A boy playing at being a doctor in a graveyard. Edward managed to wedge his stick between them, pushing Ares back. A graveyard you filled, Ares. They struggled out onto the external gallery, the narrow, circular balcony that hugged the top of the tower. The storm was a monster here. The wind tried to rip them from the stone. Rain turned the floor into a skating rink of slick granite. Below them, the red flare from the approaching ship was blindingly close. Without Silas at the lens to guide them through the needle, the narrow gap between the rocks, the ship was heading straight for the jagged teeth of the western cliffs. Stop it! Edward shouted over the wind. The ship. They're going to hit the rocks. Ares looked over the railing, his eyes wide. For a moment, his greed fought with his survival. He needed that ship to land safely to get his final payment. He turned back to the lantern room, trying to reach the signal lever. But the sea had other plans. A rogue wave, larger than any before it, struck the base of the cliff. The vibration traveled up the granite tower like an earthquake. Ares lost his footing. He slid across the wet gallery, his hands clawing at the slick stone. He reached for the railing, but his fingers, numbed by the cold, found no purchase. With a final, silent look of shock, the man who had played the ghost for 10 years vanished into the black abyss. There was no cry, only the roar of the ocean. Edward collapsed against the wall, gasping for air. He looked out at the bay. The red flare died out. A terrible sound followed, the screaming of wood and iron as the secret ship, the Marianne's successor, was torn apart by the rocks. By dawn, the storm had retreated to a dull, grey drizzle. The village of Crimson Bay was no longer silent. Edward had spent the remaining hours of the night in the lighthouse, keeping the light turning manually until the sun rose. When he finally descended, he found the beach crowded. But it wasn't the shadows anymore. The villagers, led by Mrs. Gable, who had finally found her courage, had surrounded the mayor's mansion. The discovery of the secret cave and the ledgers Edward had found in the clinic was the final blow. The ghost was dead, and the men who served him were in chains. A week later, the sun actually shone on Crimson Bay. The water was a calm, sparkling blue, hiding its secrets once more. Edward stood on the platform of the small train station. His bags were packed, and a ticket to London was in his pocket. Mrs. Gable stood beside him. She handed him a small basket of bread and a fresh bottle of milk. "The village is quiet now, Doctor," she said softly. "Truly quiet. Not the heavy silence we had before. We owe you a great debt." Edward looked at the clinic in the distance. The windows were clean. The ghost stories had been replaced by the reality of a village that needed to heal. He looked at his ticket, then back at the cliffs. "You know, Mrs. Gable," Edward said with a small, tired smile. "I came here looking for a quiet practice. I think I finally found one." He took the ticket and tore it in half. The station master's replacement, a young man from the next town over, blew his whistle. The train pulled away, but Edward Thorne remained on the platform. He picked up his medical bag and began the walk back toward the village. There were no more shadows in the garden. There was no more blood in the clinic. There was only a doctor, a village, and the long, slow process of starting over. The arrest of Mayor Sterling should have brought peace to Crimson Bay, but as Edward sat in his clinic a week later, the air felt heavier than ever. He was no longer just the village doctor. He was the man who had toppled a decade-long empire of shadows. The villagers looked at him with a mix of gratitude and a new, unsettling kind of awe. Late one afternoon, a black carriage, far more elegant than anything seen in the village, clattered up to the clinic. A man stepped out. He was tall, dressed in charcoal grey, with an air of authority that made the locals scatter. He introduced himself as Inspector Lawty from Scotland Yard. "Dr. Thorne," Lawty said, stepping into the clinic and looking at the neatly organized files. "You've done a remarkable job cleaning up this nest of vipers, but I'm afraid you've only scratched the surface of a much larger rot." Edward wiped his hands on his apron. "I thought the ghost was dead, Inspector. Ares is at the bottom of the sea." "Ares was a pawn," Lawty replied, spreading a series of letters on Edward's desk. These were letters recovered from the mayor's hidden safe. They weren't signed with a name, but with a seal, a crest featuring a broken sword and a rising sun. The Marianne wasn't just carrying gold. She was carrying the crown jewels of a deposed European house. And the people who lost them are finally coming to claim what's left. Lawty explained that the Duke Ares had mentioned was very much alive and lived in exile in London. He had been funding the smuggling ring to buy his way back to his throne. With the mayor in jail and the gold lost to the sea, the Duke's agents were moving toward Crimson Bay to ensure no witnesses remained to tell the world where the money had gone. "You are the star witness, Edward," Lawty warned. "And stars have a habit of burning out." That night, the rain returned, but it lacked the violent fury of the storm that had killed Ares. It was a cold, persistent drizzle that blurred the lines between the sea and the sky. Edward walked to the window, the inspector's words echoing in his mind. He was being watched again. Not by a ghost, but by professional men in grey coats. A knock came at the door. It wasn't the frantic banging of a patient. It was 3 slow, deliberate raps. Edward gripped his walking stick and opened the door. A woman stood there. She was drenched, her fine silk dress ruined by the mud. She wore a veil that hid her face, but her eyes, visible through the mesh, were a startling, piercing green. "I am not here for medicine, Dr. Thorne," she said, her accent thick and European. "I am here for the silver box you found on the beach." Edward stepped back, allowing her inside. "That box is evidence in a murder trial, madam. That box contains a locket with my mother's portrait," she countered, lifting her veil. She was beautiful, but her face was etched with a deep, ancient sorrow. "I am Elena, daughter of the Duke. My father is a man of many sins, but that ship was my only hope of a life away from his madness. He didn't want the gold to buy a throne. He wanted it to pay for an army." She told a story of a father obsessed with a lost kingdom and a daughter who tried to stop him. She claimed that the Marianne had been sabotaged not just from the shore, but from within. There was a second traitor, someone who had survived the wreck and lived in the village even now. The mayor was a fool, and Ares was a psychopath. Elena whispered. "But the third man is the one who truly holds the keys to the bay." Elena's revelation sent Edward's mind spinning. He had assumed the conspiracy ended with the mayor, the station master, and Silas. But the math didn't add up. Someone had to have handled the legal documents, the land deeds for the secret warehouses, and the offshore accounts in London. "Who is he?" Edward asked. "He is the man who stays in the background." Elena replied. "The man who keeps the records." Edward thought of the village register. He thought of the small, quiet office near the harbour where all the shipping manifests were kept. The man who ran it was a recluse named Mr. Pendergast. He was a small, balding man who rarely spoke and seemed entirely obsessed with his ledgers. The next morning, Edward visited the records office. It was a cramped building that smelled of old parchment and ink. Pendergast was at his desk, his spectacles perched on the tip of his nose. "Ah, the good doctor," Pendergast chirped, not looking up. "Come to check the birth records. Or perhaps the death tolls. We've had a spike in those lately." "I'm looking for the manifest of the Mary Ann," Edward said directly. Pendergast's pen stopped moving. A single drop of black ink fell onto the page, blooming like a dark flower. "That manifest was lost at sea, Doctor. You know that." "I found a silver box, Mr. Pendergast. And in it was a letter." The letter mentioned a red cross on the cliffs, but it also mentioned a second location, a place where the spirit of the bay rests. Pendergast finally looked up. His eyes were not the eyes of a clerk. They were cold, calculating, and devoid of any human warmth. "You are a very talented doctor, Edward. You have a way of finding things that are meant to be buried. But sometimes, the diagnosis is terminal." Pendergast stood up and walked to a small stove in the corner. "You look cold, Doctor. Let us have some tea and discuss these manifestations of yours." Edward watched him carefully. He remembered the symptoms of Mr. Webb and the fisherman. The bites were one thing, but the lethargy and the confusion were another. He realized that Aries, the doctor, wasn't the only one with medical knowledge. Pendergast had worked as a chemist in London before coming to the Bay. As Pendergast poured the tea, Edward noticed a small, blue vial hidden in the palm of the man's hand. It was a classic move of a poisoner. "Thank you," Edward said, taking the cup. He didn't drink. He set it on the table and looked at the ledger Pendergast had been writing in. It wasn't a record of ships. It was a list of names, the same names from the ghost files in Aris's cabinet. But next to these names were numbers. Sums of money. "You weren't just the clerk," Edward said. "You were the accountant. You were the one who made the gold disappear into thin air." Pendergast sighed, a sound of genuine disappointment. "Gold is just a metal, Edward. Information is the true currency. I knew what was on the Mary Ann before she even left France. I helped the Duke plan the wreck. But the Duke is a sentimental old man. He wants a kingdom. I just want a comfortable retirement." Suddenly, Edward felt a sharp pain in his hand. He looked down. He hadn't drunk the tea, but he had touched the handle of the cup. The handle had been coated in a contact poison, something that absorbed through the skin. His vision began to blur. The room felt like it was spinning. Pendergast reached into his desk and pulled out a small, sharp scalpel. "It's a shame," Pendergast said, stepping closer. "You would have made an excellent partner. But as they say in the medical profession, we must remove the infection to save the body." Edward's legs felt like they were made of lead. He tried to stand, but he collapsed against the bookshelf, sending a shower of old ledgers to the floor. Pendergast moved with surprising speed for a man of his age, the scalpel gleaming in the dim light. "Don't fight it, Edward," Pendergast whispered. "It's a derivative of nightshade. In 5 minutes, your heart will simply forget how to beat." Edward's hand fumbled in his medical bag. He knew the antidote for nightshade, physostigmine. But he didn't have it. He had something else. He pulled out a small bottle of strong ammonia used for waking patients who had fainted. He uncorked it and threw the liquid directly into Pendergast's eyes. The clerk screamed, dropping the scalpel and clutching his face. The ammonia burned, blinding him instantly. Edward dragged himself toward the door. Every breath was a struggle. He reached the street and saw the grey mist of the bay. He needed to get to the clinic. He needed to induce vomiting and find a stimulant to keep his heart moving. He saw a figure approaching through the fog. For a terrifying moment, he thought it was one of the Duke's men. But it was Elena. She saw him stumbling and ran forward, catching him before he hit the stones. "He poisoned me." Edward gasped. "The office. Pendergast." Elena didn't hesitate. She dragged him toward her carriage. "We go to the clinic. I know what he uses. My father taught him everything he knows about the quiet death." As the carriage sped through the village, Edward looked back. The records office was in flames. Pendergast had set fire to the building to destroy the evidence, even while blinded. The past was burning, but the danger was only beginning. The third man had been revealed, but the Duke was still out at sea, and the final battle for Crimson Bay was about to move from the shadows into the light. The carriage jolted as Elena drove the horses toward the clinic. Edward's heart was a sluggish hammer in his chest, and his lungs felt like they were filling with sand. The nightshade was taking hold. They reached the clinic just as Edward's vision went completely dark. Elena hauled him inside, her strength surprising for someone of her stature. She didn't head for his medical bag. She went straight for a small, ornate wooden box she had brought from the carriage. "My father is a man of poisons," she whispered, her voice trembling. "But he is also a man of precautions. He gave this to me when I was a child." She pulled out a small glass vial containing a thick, milky white liquid. She forced it down Edward's throat. The taste was bitter, like crushed walnuts and iron, but almost immediately, the heavy fog in his mind began to thin. What was that? Edward coughed, the color returning to his face. "A concentrated stimulant and a binding agent," Elena said, watching the door. "It will keep your heart beating, but you will be weak for hours." "We don't have hours, Edward. Look." She pointed out the window. Through the thinning mist, the bay was no longer empty. 3 large, dark ships sat anchored just outside the harbor. They weren't merchant vessels. They were sleek, fast, and bristling with cannons. The Duke's privateers. Elena said, "They aren't here for gold anymore. They are here to erase Crimson Bay. If the world finds out what happened here, my father's hopes for a return to power are finished. He would rather burn 100 villages than spend one day in a cell." Edward stood up, leaning heavily on the examination table. "Then we don't just need a doctor. We need a way to stop a fleet." Edward knew the village had no cannons, no army, and no defense except for the geography of the bay itself. He remembered the diagram of the lighthouse and the needle rocks. "The lighthouse," Edward said. "If we can change the signal, we can lure them onto the rocks just as Silas did to the Marianne. But we need a light stronger than the one in the tower." He thought of the signal hill, a high peak on the eastern side of the bay used in the old days for warning against the Spanish Armada. At the top was a massive iron brazier, long since rusted and forgotten. "If we light that brazier, the ships will think it's the harbor entrance," Edward explained. "They'll turn too early and hit the hidden reef." They moved through the village, waking the survivors, the fishermen and factory workers who had lived under the mayor's thumb. Edward told them the truth. He told them that the ships in the bay were coming to finish what the ghost had started. Fear turned into a cold, desperate bravery. The men grabbed oil, coal, and dry wood. They began the climb up Signal Hill in total silence. They were no longer afraid of ghosts. They were fighting for their homes. The Duke's ships didn't wait for the tide. At midnight, a flash of orange light erupted from the lead ship, the Vengeance. A second later, the sound of a cannon blast tore through the air. A stone cottage near the harbor exploded into rubble. "Light it!" Edward screamed from the base of the hill. A match was struck. The oil-soaked wood in the brazier caught fire instantly, sending a massive pillar of orange flame toward the black sky. It was a beacon that could be seen for 20 miles. On the lead ship, the navigator saw the fire. To a stranger, it looked exactly like the harbor mouth. The Vengeance began to turn, its massive sails catching the wind as it accelerated toward the safe passage. "Wait for it," Elena whispered, her hand gripping Edward's arm. The sound that followed was like 1,000 trees snapping at once. The Vengeance hit the reef at full speed. The jagged rocks tore the bottom out of the ship, and the mast collapsed forward, crushing the deck. The ship tilted violently to the side, its cannons sliding into the sea. But there were 2 ships left, and they had realized the trap. The remaining 2 ships didn't try to enter the harbor. Instead, they lowered dozens of small rowing boats. Hundreds of armed men, mercenaries in the Duke's pay, began to row toward the shore. "They're coming for the village," a fisherman cried out. Edward looked at the men around him. They were armed with harpoons, heavy wrenches, and old hunting rifles. They were outnumbered 5 to 1. "We can't fight them on the beach," Edward said. "We lead them into the factory. The narrow corridors and the steam pipes. We can use them to our advantage." They retreated into the massive fish canning factory owned by the late mayor. It was a labyrinth of iron vats, heavy machinery, and hissing pipes. Edward knew the layout from his visits to treat the workers. He knew which valves were loose and which floorboards were rotten. The mercenaries hit the shore and marched toward the factory, led by a man in a red uniform. General Kroll, the Duke's right hand. They expected a village of cowards. They found a fortress of iron. The factory was pitch black. The only sound was the steady clack-clack of the cooling boilers. The mercenaries entered the main hall, their lanterns casting long, nervous shadows. "Come out, Doctor," Kroll shouted, his voice echoing off the high ceiling. "The Duke offers a reward for your head. Why die for a handful of fish sellers?" Edward was high above them on the catwalk. He looked at the pressure gauge of the main steam boiler. It was in the red. "Now!" Edward signaled. A worker pulled a lever. A series of safety valves blew open simultaneously. A wall of blindingly hot steam hissed into the hall, filling the air with a thick, white fog. The mercenaries panicked, unable to see more than a foot in front of them. In the confusion, the villagers struck. They used the shadows and the noise of the steam to pick off the mercenaries one by one. It wasn't a battle. It was a harvest. Edward watched from above, but his eyes were fixed on the back entrance. He saw a man entering through the fog, a man who didn't look like a soldier. He was old, dressed in royal purple, and he carried a silver-headed cane. The Duke had arrived to settle his own debts. The steam hissed and roared, a white wall that separated the hunters from the hunted. High on the iron catwalk, Edward watched the man in the royal purple coat. This was the Duke, the man whose ambition had fueled a decade of death. He didn't look like a warrior. He looked like a relic of a dying world, clutching a silver cane as if it were a scepter. The Duke stepped over a fallen mercenary, his boots clicking on the metal floor. He didn't seem bothered by the chaos or the scalding steam. He looked up, his eyes finding Edward through the haze. "So, this is the man who broke my machine," the Duke said, his voice carrying a strange, melodic calm. "A village doctor with a penchant for meddling. Do you have any idea how much effort it took to build this network? Dr. Thorne." Edward descended the ladder, his hand steady on his walking stick. "Effort built on the bodies of the Mary Ann's crew. You aren't a king, you're a grave robber." The Duke laughed. but it turned into a harsh cough. He leaned on his cane. History is written by the survivors. Edward, if I had succeeded, I would have been a restorer of order. Now, I am merely a shadow in your little story. Suddenly, the Duke lunged. He wasn't as frail as he appeared. He pressed a button on his silver cane, and a thin, needle-like blade shot out from the tip. It was a duelist's weapon, designed for quick, lethal strikes. Edward barely parried the thrust with his heavy stick. They circled each other in the center of the factory floor. Around them, the sounds of the struggle faded as the villagers drove the remaining mercenaries toward the harbor. It was just the doctor and the aristocrat. "You're tired, Edward," the Duke taunted, his blade dancing in the dim light. "The nightshade is still in your blood. I can see your hands shaking." It was true. The antidote had saved his life, but his strength was fading. He needed to end this quickly. He backed away toward the main pressure tank, the heart of the factory's steam system. "You want your gold," Edward shouted, his back against the vibrating metal of the tank. "It's not in the lighthouse. It's not in the cave. I moved it, Duke. I moved it to the one place you'll never find it." The Duke's composure broke. The thought of losing his treasury, the key to his return to power, sent him into a frenzy. He charged, the sword cane aimed directly at Edward's heart. Edward waited until the last possible second. He dropped to the floor and swung his stick not at the Duke, but at the main pressure release valve on the side of the tank. The iron handle snapped. A jet of high-pressure steam erupted sideways, hitting the Duke full in the chest. It wasn't enough to kill him, but the force knocked him backward into a row of heavy iron vats. The Duke fell, his sword cane spinning across the floor. Before he could recover, the villagers emerged from the fog. They didn't use weapons. They simply stood in a circle, their faces grim. The Duke looked up, seeing not fish sellers, but the judge and jury of Crimson Bay. "Take him to the cells," Edward commanded, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The same cells where he wanted to put the world. With the Duke captured and his ships retreating, a strange silence fell over the village. The sun began to rise, a pale gold light that touched the wreckage of the Vengeance on the reef. Edward sat in the clinic, his hands finally stopping their tremors. Elena sat across from him. She looked at her father's silver cane, which Edward had recovered from the factory. "It's over," she said, though there was no joy in her voice. "The Duke is a prisoner of the Queen's law now. He will never see his kingdom." "There is one thing I don't understand," Edward said. "In the factory, he seemed so sure the gold was gone. But I never moved it. I don't even know where the bulk of it is." Elena looked away. "My father didn't just want the gold for an army, Edward. He wanted it because of what's hidden inside the gold. The French treasury wasn't just coins. It contained the Blue Heart, a diamond that was said to be a gift to the French crown from the Orient." Edward remembered the gold coin he found in the sea wall. He pulled it from his pocket and looked at the face of the French king. He realized that the coin felt different. It was slightly thicker than it should be. He took a small surgical hammer and tapped the edge of the coin. The gold shell cracked. Inside, a sliver of blue light caught the morning sun. It wasn't a coin. It was a hollow container, and inside was a fragment of a gemstone so blue it looked like a piece of the deep ocean. They split the diamond. Edward whispered, "Every coin in that shipment, every one of them is a piece of the Blue Heart." This was the ultimate secret. The treasure wasn't just money. It was a jigsaw puzzle of the most valuable gemstone in the world. To the casual observer, it was just old gold. But to someone who knew, it was a fortune beyond imagining. "If the world finds out about this," Elena said, "the looters will never leave Crimson Bay. They'll dig up every street and tear down every house looking for the rest of the coins. Edward looked out at the village. The people were finally beginning to breathe again. Children were playing in the streets. If he revealed the truth about the coins, he would destroy the peace he had fought so hard to win. He walked to the fireplace and looked at the glowing embers. He looked at the blue fragment in his hand. Then the world must never find out. Edward said. Edward and Elena spent the day collecting every single gold coin they could find. They took them from the lighthouse, from the mayor's safe, and from the pockets of the captured mercenaries. They didn't keep them. That night, they took a small boat out to the Needle Rocks. The water was deep there, the current strong enough to pull anything to the bottom of the Atlantic. One by one, Edward dropped the coins into the black water. There goes the Duke's kingdom, Elena said as the last coin vanished. And there goes the ghost of Crimson Bay, Edward added. As they rowed back to shore, Edward felt a sense of finality. He had come to this village to escape the noise of London, and he had found a melody of his own. He was no longer the man who asked too many questions. He was the man who protected the answers. But as he stepped onto the dock, he saw a new figure waiting for him. It was a man in a black suit, carrying a legal folder. Dr. Thorne. The man asked. I'm from the Medical Board of London. We've received a very strange report about your conduct here. It seems we need to discuss your license. Edward smiled. The battle for the village was over, but the battle for his life as a doctor was just beginning. The man from the medical board, Mr. Sterling, no relation to the former mayor, though the name sent a sour chill through Edward, stood with a stiff posture that suggested he had never stepped foot on a boat or a muddy cliff in his life. He looked at Edward's salt-stained coat and weary eyes with profound distaste. Dr. Thorne, Mr. Sterling began, tapping his legal folder. The allegations against you are grave. Negligence, involvement in local criminal activities, and the unauthorized use of restricted chemicals, namely, the nightshade and stimulants reported by the late Mr. Pendergast's records. Edward stood his ground. The criminal activities I was involved in, sir, were the defense of this village against a private army, and the chemicals were used to save my life after I was poisoned by the very man who kept those records. That is for the board to decide, Sterling replied coldly. You are hereby summoned to London for a formal inquiry. Until then, your license to practice medicine is suspended. You are to shutter this clinic immediately. The news hit the village like a second storm. Mrs. Gable wept openly, and the fishermen gathered at the clinic door, their faces set in angry lines. They wanted to drive Mr. Sterling into the sea, but Edward raised a hand to quiet them. I will go, Edward said. I have nothing to hide. If the law in London wants the truth about Crimson Bay, I will give it to them. But I do not go as a prisoner. I go as a witness. Elena walked to his side, her eyes flashing with defiance. And he will not go alone. I have my own testimony to give regarding my father's reach and the corruption of the men who tried to break this doctor. The train ride to London felt like a journey to another planet. The grey stone of Crimson Bay was replaced by the soot and clamour of the city. The inquiry was held in a vaulted chamber at the Royal College of Surgeons. A panel of 5 elderly doctors sat behind a high bench, looking down at Edward as if he were a strange specimen under a microscope. Dr. Thorne, the lead inquisitor, Sir William, began. You took a post in a remote village and, within a month, the mayor is in prison, the former doctor is dead, and you are accused of acting more like a mercenary than a physician. How do you explain this? Edward stepped forward. He didn't speak of gold or diamonds. He spoke of the Hippocratic Oath. He spoke of a doctor's duty not just to heal the body, but to protect the community from the rot that causes the illness. I found a village suffering from a cancer, Edward said, his voice echoing in the hall. That cancer was greed and fear. I used the tools I had to excise it. If my methods were unconventional, It is because the disease was unprecedented. One by one, the evidence was presented. The silver box, the logs of the Marianne, and finally, the testimony of Elena. She spoke of her father's madness and how Edward was the only man with the courage to stand against it. The board deliberated for 3 days. Edward spent the time walking the streets of London, the noise of the carriages sounding like the roar of the ocean he had left behind. He realized he missed the salt air. He missed the stubborn, quiet strength of the villagers. On the 4th day, he was called back to the chamber. Sir William looked at him over his spectacles. "Dr. Thorne, we find that while your actions were extreme, they were taken in the interest of public safety and under duress. However, the medical board cannot overlook the destruction of the clinic's official records." Edward held his breath. "Therefore," Sir William continued, "your license is reinstated, but with a condition. You are to remain in Crimson Bay for a period of no less than 5 years. You are to rebuild the clinic and provide an annual report of your service to this board. You are, in essence, sentenced to be the doctor they so desperately need." Edward felt a surge of relief so strong he had to lean against the mahogany table. It wasn't a punishment. It was a homecoming. Edward and Elena returned to Crimson Bay on a crisp autumn morning. The village had changed. The factory was now a cooperative, run by the workers themselves. The ghost stories were now told as tales of victory over darkness, rather than whispers of fear. They walked to the cliffs, looking out at the spot where the secret ship had gone down. The water was clear and blue. "What will you do now, Elena?" Edward asked. "The Duke's lawyers have reached an agreement," she said. "He will spend his life in a comfortable, but very secure, villa in Scotland. I will stay here for a while. I think I've had enough of kingdoms and crowns. I'd like to see what a quiet life looks like." They reached the lighthouse. A new keeper had been hired, a veteran sailor who actually kept the light turning for its intended purpose. Edward looked at the brass key in his hand, the one he had stolen from the mayor's desk. He threw it into the sea. Years passed. The name Dr. Edward Thorne became a legend in the coastal towns of England. He was the man who could set a bone, cure a fever, and, if the need arose, defend a village against the shadows. The clinic was no longer a place of secrets. It was bright, filled with the smell of clean linen and fresh herbs. Above the door, Edward had placed a small carving of a red cross, not as a marker for treasure, but as a symbol of sanctuary. On a quiet evening, Edward sat on his porch, watching the tide come in. He pulled a small, worn notebook from his pocket. On the first page, he had written, "A doctor must see what others choose to ignore." The ghost of Crimson Bay was long gone, but the man who had found him remained. Edward looked at the horizon, where the lighthouse lamp began its steady, rhythmic turn. The light didn't signal to smugglers or ships of war. It simply showed the way home. The mystery was solved. The gold was at the bottom of the sea, and the doctor of Crimson Bay finally went inside to a warm fire and a peaceful sleep.